Welcome students to the online NPTEL course Visual Communication Design for Digital Media. In the previous lectures we were discussing about the elements and principles of design. We discussed what are the different elements with the permutation and combination of different elements, how we can design with after applying the different principles of design. Then we also discussed about the typography, how to incorporate typography, how to design, if you want to design a new typefaces, how to design them, and how to blend with the pictures and the photographs what you are designing in the visual communication design on digital media. And then we also discussed about what are the different domains of digital media available, what are the different paradigms. And then we also, this part was the part of design concerning the process of design. Then we also move towards the process of interpretation from the user's perspective. Then we discussed the semiotic theories and with the detailed discussion of signs and iconographs and what means what with the semiotics, pragmatic, semantics, pragmatics and all these things. And then we also discussed about the perceptions. So what is the visual perception happens after you design something and how people look at it. So it is all what we were discussing, it's dependent on the user's perception as well as their socio-cultural backdrop. But there is another factor which is the time, and design changes over time. So time factor is also important, and this is right now in this module, and the next module we will talk about the how design and visual language changes over time. So we will discuss the contemporary visual language in the platform of design. We will not only discuss just the digital design platform, because it's there is a continuum with the art and design, and everything fuses, everything is amalgamated together, and there is no clear cut line from where the design evolved and from where art which field is art and which field is what kind of visual language is there in design. So there is all coherent and all evolve together. So we have to discuss something about the tangible design media, for example art, painting and print media. But we are not discussing about the history part of it. We divide history and contemporary from the time of industrial revolution. So pre-industrial revolution till Renaissance, Baroque and Rococo, all these things were is discussed within the history part of art. And then from industrial revolution, so post industrial revolution, we discuss we think we name that part as contemporary design and art. So as design, the domain design is very nascent and evolving. It's more related towards the contemporary. It's also definitely related to with the history part of it, but it's more evolved with the of the changes with the contemporary art and design. So we start with the post-industrial revolution contemporary part, and we within the contemporary part we will discuss about modernism and postmodernism, and after discussing postmodernism we'll discuss that how digital media evolved and how what are the different visual styles in digital media. So contemporary, we use the term contemporary art and the art history and contemporary design and history. So there is a slight difference, and we differentiate this era of contemporary from industrial revolution. So industrial revolution, you must know, you must have known this. It happened in mostly in Europe, and then it flourished all over the world. So industrial revolution happened just after I mean it's a continuation of Renaissance. So after Renaissance there was a lot of industrialization, and people from village moved to the city, and a lot of manufacturing, mass production and technology boom happened. So before industrial revolution, there was mostly the art and architecture was has perception of over ornamentation. So Baroque and Rococo was the style which was going on, and in architecture and art it was mostly the art was done in cathedral and chapels, and we can see this movements before industrial revolution was starting from Greek architecture, Roman architecture, then Gothic, and all this Victorian style of art and all these things. So there we can see there was a ornamentation and in the last art style just before pre-industrial revolution was Baroque Rococo was the predominant one. So there we can see a lot of ornamentation in architecture and interior design and furniture design, and a lot of intricacy and biomorphic patterns were there, and a dramatic effect was is created, and even in art. So there was a term called chiaroscuro, so which says that there was a dramatic effect of light and shadow. Here we can see the Vermeer's painting, girl with a pearl ring. Here you can see there is a lot of contrast in the light and shadow. So dramatic effect was, and ornamentation was the key characteristics of Baroque and Rococo. So here we can see that Bernini's St. Peter's Basilica, Rome. St. Peter's Basilica, Rome is designed by, there was a contribution of many people, starting from Michelangelo to many other artists and architects. So here Bernini's intervention in St. Peter's Basilica, you can see a lot of ornamentation was there. These kind of ornamentations and painting we need to know, because this is though it is in traditional media, but these kind of ornamentation when you use in digital graphics, and you can, if you use this kind of motifs in digital graphics, they resembles the this pre-industrial revolution or Baroque and Rococo time. So if you are creating some kind of ornamentation in your web page, or using this kind of patterns in your graphic design, so that resembles to this era. So you need to be very careful while choosing, and very selective while choosing. So if you want to recreate that and have a sense of this era, then you can translate that. So though it is in mostly in architecture and art, that is how it can affect in your mood board. So if you want to create this kind of visual language in digital media, it will help. Also there was print media, existing traditional print media was there. For example, lithography, lithography, and woodcut print. So they used to cut a wood block or stone block, or even the metal etching was process was there, and a master print block will be there, and you apply a color and press on top of on a paper or canvas, and the motif will be generated. So here you can see the Saturn motif in British Museum, carved in wood. So it looks something like that. So this process is not only predominant was there in Europe, and also there in the Far Eastern Japanese and Chinese art. So you can see Japanese and Chinese woodcut print, which was there from far before the Industrial Revolution. And in Industrial Revolution, as we were discussing in the typography lecture module, that time Gutenberg in Germany invented the press. That time the typefaces become I mean, there was blocks of typefaces. So book printing was there. So book printing was much later, but printing images and making this kind of master copies of the negative of the print was much before Gutenberg invented the press. And when Gutenberg invented the press, that time the typography, there was a absolute paradigm shift in the typography and how we perceive typography. But these kind of print medias in painting and artwork and traditional print media was much before Industrial Revolution. And one of the, in the animation section, when we will discuss the methodology of animation, one of the animation will be discussed, which was derived from the visual style of this woodcut and linocut print, so that you understand why these are important to understand. And though it is in the traditional media, but important to understand the visual language. What was the visual language? Here you can see there was a lot of wooden textures, and a particular kind of texture will be available in this kind of printing. So when you translate this kind of style into digital media, this kind of texture you have to use to relate with the visual language of different era. So in 19th century industrial revolution, it was the genesis of modernism. From there, complete change in the visual sense and the visual language was there. And so there was a shift from agriculture to industry. There was a mass production was started, because there was industrial revolution. A lot of factory was made, and to generate the factory, and to establish different kind of architecture was there. So we see a lot of influence of steel and glass, and those kind of high-rise buildings started evolving. Even in design, a lot of tessellation, or the pattern, different kind of pattern, and machine made and factory made things were there in the design. So after that, the more modular concept of modular furnitures, modular design started evolving. That we'll discuss gradually. So if we look at the timeline from where it started, so it's a timeline based on design and architecture and art. So industrial revolution was a shift from there to 1950s or 1980s. In terms of architecture, it's a little late, 1980s, and in terms of art and design, it will be from 1950s onwards till 1950s to 1980s. There was a modernist period. So that time there was a you know that after industrial revolution, after Renaissance, industrial revolution happened, and after industrial revolution there was a lot of you know that there was World War, and that time and that created a lot of effect in art and design as well. After that, in 1980s, world became more stable in terms of economy, and postmodern, that era began. That postmodern style is a little different, and there was a lot of difference in postmodern and modern, but together modern and postmodern creates the contemporary era. So this part from industrial revolution in the beginning of the early 90s to 1950s or 1980s, this is a modernist era, this part of the time frame, and after that there is a postmodernist era. Till now we are in a postmodern era, and from industrial revolution, total this modern and postmodern is contemporary movement in art and design. So in modern era we have different isms, different style evolved in modern era, and from early modern there were a lot of different contrasting style, we will say, because there are a lot of visual difference between these styles. They evolved, and gradually they evolved towards the late modern period, and which is around 1950s to 1980s, and after 1980s gradually we evolved into postmoderns. So there is no exact timeline from where modernist movement evolved into postmodern movement, but still we can say from 1950s to 1980s, depending on the art domain, art, architecture and design, they go parallelly, but still there is a change. We cannot make a clear-cut line from where modernist to postmodern movement started, but it's more or less in late 90s. So in modern movement we have art nouveau and art and craft movement. This started first. So when industrial revolution happened, so there was two school of thought. One was against the machine and one was in favor of machine, because a lot of machine made things were started generating, and which was, and before that there was the we were dependent most on the artisans and artist hand skill. So we can see that just before that there was a Baroque and Rococo movement. So Baroque and Rococo movement, if we see, so this was highly ornamental, so that was dependent on the craftsmanship. But after modern, when the industrial revolution started, so the craftsmanship and the dying, was started to die because machine took over. So there was two school of thought. One opposed this, so against the machine movement, and one was accepting it, which was the for the machine movement. In architecture, it's more clearly visible, and also in design, because art. De Stijl movement, Bauhaus movement, they were emerged from minimalist approach of design. But there were some design movements, for example, Art Nouveau, and also art and craft movement and Art Deco. They accepted the ornamentation, and Art Nouveau was highly ornamental, and art and craft movement and Art Deco started blending the ornamentation with the mass production. And after that, there was futurist, cubist, surrealist. These movements were there. So first, talking about Art Nouveau. Art Nouveau was in the initial stages where there was a dilemma whether to go in favor of modern mass production or not. So Art Nouveau is highly ornamental, and combines the and gives emphasis on the craftsmanship and artistic skills of individual. So we can see Alphonse Mucha's work. So here, if you look at the paintings, so here a lot of biomorphic ornamental curves were there. So if you look at this kind of ornamentations and this kind of intricacies of work, so you can see that this cannot be mass produced, and this is highly dependent on the artistic skill and the curves and the way it is abstraction happened in the art form. So it's highly ornamental, and a lot of curvilinear features were there, and none of the forms were modular, none of the features are repeated, and most of the ornamentation you can see has a lot of influence from Baroque and Rococo style, though definitely not has a lot of difference. For example, there was some industrial revolutions effect on this. And if you look at also architecture, you should also look at some other domains. In architecture, Antonio Gaudi's work and Victor Horta's interior design and furniture design and architecture work, if you look at, they have a similar kind of line quality, similar kind of fluidity in adopting biomorphic design in Art Nouveau style. And if you look at their furniture design and the facade treatment of Antonio Gaudi's building and interior ornamentations, so you can see that none of these buildings is possible to create by industrial manufacturing. So each and every facade has to be is an example of high craftsmanship. Some of the buildings in Barcelona, if you look at, so these buildings took a lot of time to complete. Even some of the buildings are yet not complete. So that was Art Nouveau style. Now look at the art and craft movement. So here we have William Morris's print and tessellation. William Morris also designed some kind of furniture. If you look at the furniture, this furniture has a lot of involvement of craftsmanship, but yet if you look at carefully, these kind of formations in print media has repetition. So right now we today's apparel design and textile design, we do this kind of tessellation. This is called tessellation. So one block has a mirror image, and after some time this similar ornamentation will be repeated on top in this side and the other side. So they create a very biomorphic, zoomorphic or floral patterns, but still they have a possibility to incorporate machine production into to generate a faster production. So here there are a lot of influence from the ornamental stylization and ornamental aesthetic sense. of biomorphic style and curvilinear pattern, but they are repeated so that they incorporate craftsmanship and industrial mass production. So they take the facilities, the benefits and the positive side of the industrial mass production for faster production to increase the production rate, and also incorporates the craftsmanships and the quality of the aesthetic quality and the visual language of the crafts artisans and the traditional form. And then we have Art Deco. Art Deco is different from Art Nouveau and art and craft movement. They have a more industrial look. They are more they are less biomorphic. The curves and the line qualities become more towards the rectilinear, but yet not completely as rectilinear as the later phases of art movement. For example, De Stijl or futurist or cubist style. They have some rectilinearity. They are a fusion of rectilinearity and curvilinearity, and even there is a they use gradient shades, gradient textures, but more in a digital. They have a digitally generated. They have aesthetics and the look of digitally generated image. So we will see some examples, but it started. So this is an eclectic form of art that combines handcrafted traditional motif and with the machine made visual style. So from Art Nouveau, art and craft movement was more towards marrying these two paradigm of handcrafted and the machine made, and Art Deco taken this to farther, one step farther, and then they involved more machine made and geometric forms into and without compromising the artistic sense. So here some of the examples we have. Cassandra's visuals and poster designs. So if we look at the poster, so if you look at the design of a train wheel, they are abstract, they are highly abstract, and some of the forms, without losing the detailing, they are translated into more geometric shapes. So towards the more biomorphic style, we are moving towards the more geometric, incorporating more geometry and minimalizing, and towards more abstraction. Even the way the bird and the wine glass is conceptualized, this is broken into simpler geometry. Even if you look at the gradient, so that a gradient has a line from here, it's there is a sharp change of color, and also if you look at the line qualities he has used. So here this headgear changes, there is a sharp contrast over here. The line continues through the gradient and fades away, and here also these lines and the ears, the way it has been conceptualized, it's highly geometric. And even if you look at this kind of forms, the later movements of De Stijl and Bauhaus also inspired from Art Deco. If you remember this kind of form later when we will discuss Bauhaus, you will see some similar kind of abstraction of human faces. Even if you look at the abstraction of the shapes, so it talks about the grandeur of the size of the shape, but still if you can if you see the geometry, so there is a rectilinear lines are appearing, and shape the form of the shape is broken into a simpler geometry. So you can perceive a rectangle here in the form of a shape. So this rectilinear lines are there, and even there is a curve which blends properly with the rectangle. So if you look at the gradients and the use of colors, so they have much more defined lines here, and versus if you look at the way they have used gradients in art and craft movement. Art and craft movement is still more has a sharp geometry, but if you look at the Art Nouveau, so here if you look at the use of gradients, so they are much more gradual, and they mimic the way human figure appears. So but here there is a sharp abstraction, and geometric abstraction is there. and Olympica's work. So Tamara de Olympica, if you see the way she's transforming the human figures and the draperies into into more geometric abstraction, so we can see we can understand this better. So if you see the way they are treating the hairs here, and if you look at the way it was there in Art Nouveau style, they are drastically different. So here we have a lot of machine made qualities. They appear more like a digitally generated images, and here also the human figures, they are broken into geometry, they are broken into a lot of overlapping surfaces, and has a metallic finish on that. So that also incorporates the industrial taste in the taste of industrial revolution. So a lot of use of metal and glass was there in architecture, interior design and furniture design. So here in painting and design, graphic design as well, though the taste of metals, the shines of metals, and the geometry of the era, geometric aesthetic, the geometric visual language of the era is translated in and is imbibed in the visual design and graphic design as well. Some other examples here, we can see a clear geometric transformation, and this is in these kind of typefaces also evolved during Art Deco movement. So here in the typefaces also you can see a lot of geometry. The typefaces are broken into geometry, but there are a lot of ornamentation in the typefaces. So these typefaces are highly ornamental. So D could have been written just with one line and the other. So that is the most late modern and minimalist style of writing. But here the Art Deco style, Art Nouveau and Art Craft movement, they have highly ornamental and these isms, art movements are highly ornamental. So here a lot of ornamentations are added here, but still you can see there are a lot of they are depicted in terms of geometric abstraction. So there is a Broadway font typefaces which is developed by Maurice Fuller Benton. It's also follows the Art Deco style, and here we can see, if you have seen the movie Great Gatsby, that is completely the set design, the costume design and everything, and is based on Art Deco style. Even the New York Times Square, that the building, the signages, if you look at the signages, they are all Art Deco style signages. Even the some of the buildings like Chrysler buildings of New York, that's a complete that's a perfect example of Art Deco style. And here this kind of interior work, this is a door. So this kind of patterns evolved in Art Deco. So here you can see some patterns of which resemble which is of clearly Art Deco style. So if you want to translate Art Deco style into digital platform, or you want to create some visual which gives a connotation of Art Deco style, so these kind of typography you have to use, and this kind of form, this kind of textures, this kind of patterns you should provide. And you can see a lot of patterns are has black and gold, black and metallic finish, so that to incorporate the industrial look. So metal was predominantly started, the incorporation of metal was started invading in interior design and architecture in this era. So metal gives a look of Art Deco movement. Then we come to the De Stijl and Bauhaus movement. So from Art Deco and De Stijl Bauhaus, there is a connection. If we look at the Bauhaus movements, the way they have depicted the figures of human being, and translated and did the abstraction of human figures and natures. They have a connection with Art Deco, but they are definitely less ornamental, more geometric, and their philosophy is completely different from the Art Deco movement. So we can say they have the philosophy of purity of design. Purity of design they established by the selection of color, selection of shapes and line qualities. So purity of design can be achieved in terms of color selection while we select only the primary colors. In primary colors, in while we are thinking about colors, not in things in terms of light. So primary colors will be red, blue and yellow. If we mix red and blue, we get purple color in color mixing theory, and then if we mix blue and yellow, we get green, and if we mix red and yellow, then we get orange. But in terms of light, it's absolutely different. It's RGB, and the additive combination of color is different. But in Bauhaus, they have thought about the color mixing process. So the primary colors become red, yellow and blue. So in some cases, they have also used green in terms of, as green is also a different entity, and RGB system is also used. So red, green, red, blue and yellow, plus sometimes green is used. And also we have neutral color palette, so they have also used black and white. So they are also black is there is no light, and white is there all light in equal proportion. So black, white, red, green and red, yellow and blue, these are the color selection, the color palette of Bauhaus and De Stijl movement. And then we in terms of purity of shape, Bauhaus is depicted by rectilinear geometry, pure squares or rectangles, triangles and circles. So we can see a lot of use of circles, pure circles, triangles and rectangles and squares. So here we can and even if in architecture, if you see Bauhaus designs, the architecture, Bauhaus has a strong influence in architecture and interior design and furniture design. So Bauhaus on De Stijl furnitures, if you look at, they have the similar shapes. So De Stijl furnitures is combined, is made out of circle, triangles and rectangles, and with pure colors, red, yellow and blue, with with addition of black and white. Kandinsky's work, if we look at, so they are generated from this pure geometry, lot of pure geometric shapes and rectilinear qualities we can see in the Kandinsky's work. And again, if we think about the eye movement, Kandinsky's work does not talk about some kind of realistic figurative imageries. It's more it's talking about the eye movement. So in the previous lectures, we had discussed about the Gutenberg's theorem and how we perceive figures and how our eye moves. So here we can see in the first quadrant, if you remember, we were discussing about the 4 quadrants and how our eye is first started with the first quadrant, and then it gradually moves towards the last quadrant and then comes back. So here we can see this composition has a heavy figure and the focal point in the first quadrant. So our eye can come here first, and then we have some strong composition here in the second quadrant and the third quadrant, but the fourth quadrant is left less intricate, because as we were discussing that our eye has a tendency to go to the fourth quadrant, and then we can go to the next composition. But the painter doesn't want, painter's success is dependent when you grab your eye attention and diverge your eye to the next other quadrant, and so that people look at your artwork for more time. So if the fourth quadrant is heavy, then the people will look at this, and the next their eye will be directed towards the next picture, because our eye, we have a tendency to look from this side left to right. So it's always our eye pulls towards the right side and towards down. So here we have this side little less intricate, so that our eye again rotates and comes towards this quadrant. So there is a composition called reverse C composition. So our eye moves as a reverse C. It starts from first quadrant and then comes back, comes to the second quadrant, then fourth quadrant, and there is a strong pull in the third quadrant. So our eye rotates and comes to the third quadrant, and again we go back to the first quadrant. So we spend more time within the picture frame. So if you look at Kandinsky's work in this these two composition and understand this Gutenberg's theory, in this composition we see in the if we think about the four different quadrants, the first quadrant is heavy, and the first, second and third quadrant is also heavy, unlike of the typography and the newspaper, because in newspaper it is it is like the complete newspaper, the news informations comes as a complete design. So here in the newspaper, the initial according to our tendency of reading typefaces and reading compositions, we start from the top left and go towards the right and go towards the bottom. So the first quadrant and the fourth quadrant becomes really heavy, but in terms of composition, if we make the fourth quadrant really heavy, then we will go towards the next composition. The designers or the painter doesn't want that, because the success of the painter depends on the attention span. They can take grab the attention span from the user. So here intentionally the second and third quadrant is heavy, so it creates a reverse C composition. So from first quadrant our eye starts because we have a tendency to start from left top, and then towards the second quadrant it comes, and it doesn't really stays on the fourth quadrant. If it stays, then we'll go towards the next composition. It comes back to the third quadrant. As you can see, the third quadrant is heavy, and it goes towards the first quadrant if because the strong figure ground relationship and strong focal point you can see in the picture. In the other composition, you can see there's a diagonal connection from the second to third quadrant, so that second and third quadrant becomes really heavy, because in any way we will have our attention in the first quadrant, and if the first and fourth quadrant diagonal connection is more heavy, we will go towards the next composition. So that so to oppose that, the second quadrant and third quadrant composition is really heavy here. In the other Bauhaus and De Stijl composition, we have the predominant colors selection of as we were discussing, the blue, red and yellow, that's the primary color, and white and black is used. Even if you see the poster, there are a lot of rectilinear geometry and industrial stylization is there, and these are some Harvard Bears poster. This is one of the famous poster which depicts the Bauhaus style. So here we have the red and black combination, which also evolves the Swiss style of design. You can check the Swiss style of design and their color combinations, that black, red has a predominant emphasis on that. And here also you see the way the face of human face has been transformed, which has a lot of connection with the Art Deco style which we were discussing earlier. And here we can see the typographies are also has some similarities with the Art Deco, but they are less ornamental and more geometric. And the Stijl movement, we have to discuss Piet Mondrian. Piet Mondrian's this painting is called Broadway Boogie Woogie, which is one of the famous painting. And here also we can see a lot of the emphasis. Only the primary colors, yellow, blue and red is incorporated, and here we have white in the Broadway Boogie Woogie. In some other composition we have white and black and the various tints of grey, and some of the whites are little greyish, and so we have the neutral color palette with the primary colors. Even some of the posters, if we look at the typography used in De Stijl is written and broken into pure geometry, pure rectilinear forms, and some of the poster, they also follows the similar color palette and similar shapes and similar line quality. So after discussing all the varied advancement in the technology of digital media, in the next module onwards we will discuss what are the different methodology. We will start discussing the methodology in first we will discuss the generic design methodology in visual design domain, And then as it's a very different domains are there within the visual communication design, for example animation, game, and then we have web application, and then we also have the graphic design. They are very different. The methodology of designing in each and every domain is also different. So after discussing the general design methodology, we will discuss in each and every different segments and discuss their methodology. And we also will talk about the eye tracking system and how you can incorporate users feedback into your methodology part. Thank you.